Welcome to episode number 30 with expert threat intelligence writer Bill Brenner. Hello, and you are listening to Bill Murphy's Red Zone podcast. If you are listening for the first time, I interview leaders who inspire me in the areas of hardcore IT security, IT business leadership, innovation, creativity, entrepreneurship, and fearless living principles. Welcome to the show. Welcome to episode number 30. This is Bill Murphy, your host of the Red Zone podcast. I'm super pumped up today to introduce to you Bill Brenner. Bill's an expert at digesting threat intelligence information and making this information available to a wide pool of people, from the C-suite executives to coders and developers. Essentially, the analyst areas we've talked about, this is an area where there's massive deficiency in the numbers of analysts that are in the marketplace. So he works for Akamai, and he's a senior technical writer, and Akamai is squarely in that space of understanding what threats are out there, and Bill writes about that. And he's a writer also for CSO Online, for Liquid Matrix Security Digest, and I asked him to talk about what trends he sees in the industry that are coming that we need to be aware of. And one of them is super-vulnerabilities like Heartbleed, Shellshock, and OpenSSL, and identifying the risks these risks and vulnerabilities pose to the assets within your organization. Incident response plans, how to protect your brand, and also the humanity and security. How do we deal with the mental health aspects of IT security, which is a bit of a different approach that we've talked about on the show. So I hope you enjoy my conversation with Bill Brenner. Make sure you go to Stitcher if you're a Droid user. I love Droid phones. Use Stitcher, leave a review. Also go to iTunes. If you're an iTunes iPhone user, you can leave a review. It's quick, it's painless, it's easy. It really helps out the show. In addition to that, you can go to LinkedIn. Go to where this post resides on LinkedIn, where I publish the blogs that support this podcast, and go to the bottom and leave me a review. Let me know what you think. So with that, let's jump right into the program. Well, Bill, I want to welcome you to the show today.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So I found you online by listening to some of your podcasts and also some of your writing with Akamai, and then also prior to that with CSO Online. And, I would be interested in learning more about what it means to have a threat intelligence team, and from your angle, and just talk about a little about what you do in relation to how you write about security threat intelligence.
Sure. So it's interesting for me because my background is actually in journalism. Usually in our industry, you hear a lot about how people started off as security practitioners, and then through blogging and podcasting, they branched into journalism. For me, it was the other way around, where I was a journalist. My focus for 10 years was on the security industry. And then I decided I wanted to be part of a security team doing the actual work in addition to writing about it. So Akamai has been a great place to do that because we do have a very extensive, passionate group of researchers. And this past year, we've done a lot of work in bringing all those researchers together. We used to have a C-Cert, and then we had what was called PLX Cert, which was the cert team from Prolexic, which we had acquired a couple of years ago. Now, Security Intelligence Research Team. So we have folks who are focusing on intelligence gathering. We have people who are constantly going through the research that involves code analysis, what different attack groups are doing, what kind of tools they're using. And so my role is to inject the journalistic experience and help turn that research into easily digestible threat advisories, blog posts, podcasts, and also writing the State of the Internet report, which used to be, and there still is a version, we call it the classic State of the Internet report, which is all the data from everything that Akamai deals with. But this past year, we've also had an all security version that we call the State of the Internet Security Report. So I spend a lot of time. In fact, this week, pretty much all I've been doing is going through the data from the third quarter of 2015 and beginning to work with the researchers and the security advocates to tell the story of the third quarter.
When you're writing, who is your audience? Like, what are you're writing to an avatar or to an ideal consumer? What would be your hope that your writing resonates with?
So my audience, my focus really is pretty extensive. The parameters were a lot tighter when I was a journalist, where at one point I was focusing on mid-market companies, which I know is a focus that you tend to stick with on the podcast. At CSO Magazine, it was more the C-level chief security officer audience. And now the audience is a lot more complex. So you have Akamai customers. So we need to communicate what we're seeing directly to them and to let them know what we're doing to keep attacks off of their doorstep. But then also our audience is the larger security public. So everybody from the hacker community, research level, up to the developer level, and then onward and upward towards the C level. And we have, our customers come from, we have the US military, we have financial services companies, we have very large media and entertainment companies, we have internet providers. So it's a pretty large swath, and there are different needs for each industry in terms of the information they need to know. So we're really hitting at all the levels. So the blogging and the podcasting I do, that's all geared towards the larger security industry, or community, as some people like to call it.
So that makes sense. And I know that you have this threat intelligence team that's gathering information in research. And then you have a series of products and services that Akamai is selling and actively supporting as well. So
Yep.
Are you really aligned more with the threat intelligence side in the research, or are you kind of aligned with both at the same time?
I would say I'm aligned with both, though my specific job, I don't spend a lot of time dealing with the management stuff. However, the part of our CERT team that used to comprise CCERT has actually really all of CERT has always been very much involved with working with the product managers, and the data that we get is coming from the deployments of our products in the field. So it's really both sides of it.
Oh, I see. So a lot of the research is done based on what you're seeing within the deployed application have it at customers. Then you're correlating that information together to publish a lot of the trends that you're seeing.
Yeah, and taking that data and comparing it to what people in other companies are seeing, people who may not be Akamai customers, comparing it to what the much larger security community tends to spend most of the time talking about. So it's really taking what we are seeing from our technology deployments and sizing it up against what other companies see. And, at the end of it, giving people a bigger picture so that they can take actions that they need to take.
So so a lot of the listeners are trying to augment their teams of experts, or they might not even have experts in the security area, or they might have one or two skill sets covered but are missing the threat intelligence. So this is the analyst side of the fence is a massive gap for companies. Gentleman that was just on the podcast last week, he mentioned that like 1% of the companies in the United States actually have dedicated teams of research analysts. So how do you get this information down to teams of people that may not be able to digest the information? How are you helping them with this reporting? Like what type of format do they receive it in so that they can actually, they would be able to take action on it?
So there are so many different ways to answer that. There is a lot of information that is constantly pumped into people through social media, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, through all of the countless blogs that are out there. And what you get can feel like an echo chamber a lot of the time. And that can be hard if you are trying to really get some quick analysis or make sense of your own analysis and comparing it to others. That can be really tough. So one of the things I always try to do is, obviously the big part is directing people towards, the Akamai blog, the State of the Internet Security podcast, the Security Kahuna podcast that I do with Dave Lewis and Martin McKay, but also directing people towards what I see as the best sources out there outside of Akamai. So this is probably a good place for me to kind of tick down some examples.
Sure.
So Securosis, which is, you have analysts such as Mike Rothman, Rich Mogul, a lot of collaborators there. They put out a lot of truly excellent material that I think people who make up your audience can get a lot of very quick, easy to digest analysis from. There are also a lot of great blogs out there. So I'm a big fan of the blog put out by Jack Daniel, who, not the beverage, the man.
Of course, the beverage one would be good too.
Yeah, and I think he's a fan of the beverage, but he works for Tenable, and his role in recent years has been, he's been a big organizer of the Security B-Sides conference movement. He spends a lot of time on community development in the industry. I first met him when we were both on the board of directors for NASIG, the National Security Group, which at the time was NESIG, which was just New England based, and it was really just a small user group, and that branched out. So there are a lot of great sources out there if you know where to look. If you're the type, and everybody's the type really, but for practitioners who need to really keep an eye on news articles to know what threats are out there, I think that for vulnerability tracking and attacks that are targeting specific vulnerabilities, I'm a big fan of ThreatPost. CSO, which I used to work for, I continue to think is a great source. And let's see, there's the Security Ledger, which is put out by a colleague of mine.
Security Ledger?
Yes.
So those are great examples.
Paul Roberts.
Paul Robbins.
Paul Roberts, another former IDG employee who also did some time working at ThreatPost. And then he, from there, went and started up Security Ledger. And Akamai's actually worked pretty closely with him. He's view of the research articles that Akamai security analysts have written up, particularly the folks in our team over in Israel, the Cloud Security Intelligence, CSI group. So those are just a few of the examples of good stuff that's out there. One more that I'll mention, because I'm sure you want to move on, is SANS Institute has a site called the SANS Internet Storm Center. And it's really it's the equivalent of, if you want to get a weather forecast, so to speak, of what's going on in the internet in terms of threats and attacks. So think of it as your warning of where the thunderstorms and tornadoes may be cropping up.
Yeah, definitely.
That's a tremendous place to find that information.
So, Bill, what do you think about information sharing. What I mean by that is from the vision of having really smart people that are in the industry, maybe at the vendor side, at the Akamai and different threat intelligence services that are around the United States, and in partnership with federal government resources like FBI or Department of Homeland Security, et cetera. Do you think that ultimately we'll be able to have a common framework in which, if there is an internet storm, for example, that we have the devices essentially communicating as one, sort of like the human body responds to a virus? We don't actually have to think and plan too much about, for most varieties of infections, the body's going to mobilize its resources unless it's truly overwhelmed and you got to go to a doctor. But what do you think about that as a vision for security?
So, I mean, there are two sides of it. So, if you work for a vendor, as I do, obviously you want as many people as possible buying your technology, using your services. And obviously we have competitors and we want to stay ahead of the competition. But beyond that, sharing of research is crucial. We do information sharing with companies that we consider competitors, and we need to. And, there's a lot of information sharing between us and our customers. But looking at the larger picture, you really need companies sharing the threat information that they're getting with the wider industry, because it's the only way that we can keep ahead of the bad guys. I don't see any way for success if every company just operates from within its own silo. To me, you can't take the information you receive internally and makes proper sense of it without comparing it to what's going on elsewhere. And you hear a lot about that at the national level with the Department of Homeland Security in recent years, where they've really pushed the idea of information sharing. And that goes on a slippery slope when you're talking at the government level, because of a lot of the overreaching that we've seen with, wiretapping and, all the privacy issues that have come up and the distrust of government that's created. But I do think that there is a reasonable area where there needs to be the sharing of information.
Yeah, and even defining what that sharing means, because it can get very kumbaya. We share with information with so and so, but it really, I think ultimately, if we can share and then have that knowledge, that information ingested in a common framework into the tool sets that we have deployed, that to me is when it's getting to the point where it's actually actionable sharing, where we really, because ultimately the vendors are going to have their unique way of spinning and helping customers, but the raw fundamental knowledge that we have a 0 day and someone has that knowledge and someone else doesn't have that knowledge, I think all boats will rise with that tide. Now, how Akamai responds to that might be different than someone else, but just knowing that's been shared across the board from the government down to the private sector, I think would be really useful.
Yeah. And, that last point is important, because the information that one company receives and how the given threat affects that company isn't going to be the same from one company to the next. There's no one-size-fits-all approach. Every company, every organization is unique in terms of what their needs are. And that's why everybody has their own security teams. But, analysis goes beyond your own borders, for sure.
Bill, but what does it mean to have a third-party attack? For the folks listening, to the audience listening, what does that mean? And you had a full writing and podcast about that, but could you distill that down so we can understand what that means?
Sure. So there are a few ways to go about it. So third-party attacks, let's use WordPress as an example. So WordPress is a hugely popular blogging platform. I use it. A lot of companies use it. And WordPress has done a lot of hard work to keep its security in order. They have a lot more work to do, but, we all can always do better. But one of the challenges that we in the Akamai CERT have seen in the last year plus is that WordPress gives users access to a lot of widgets that WordPress didn't create itself. Widgets and plugins that were created by a lot of third-party companies, but they have made themselves compatible with all of these plugins. And so, for example, one of my blogs, I have a plugin that gives people a sidebar showing all the places you can find us on social media. There's a plugin that allows people to see in a certain order on the sidebar the comments that come in for posts in the blog.
Sure.
And so there's the danger of, and we covered this pretty extensively in our Q2 2015 State of the Internet Security Report. There are a lot of cases where these plugins are full of security holes. And so if you're downloading them, it's important to really know what you're getting and what the risks are. It doesn't mean that people shouldn't use these plugins. It just means be aware of where the vulnerabilities are and stay on these third-party providers to really have a clear understanding of where all their vulnerabilities are and to keep working to close those holes.
So what you're saying is that a common platform like WordPress can have third-party widgets and plugins, and that those could be essentially malware kits and or exploit kits of some sort, and that we need to be aware that those can be leveraged.
Right, and if not kits in and of themselves, kits kind of bundled in. So if you're an attacker and you want to cause some damage to WordPress, and you're looking at WordPress itself, and you see that the front door is pretty well secured, a way in is through these third-party widgets. Not all of them, but a fair number of them.
So last year there was the Heartbleed and Shellshock and Poodle frenzy, and then the larger question is, what do we do about it? And then, so building upon this kind of web vulnerabilities that we just talking about a few moments ago, I was listening to you talk with one of your researchers about, or maybe it wasn't a researcher, but it was one of your directors about the next step with SSL, which of course Heartbleed, Shellshock, and Poodle are essentially exploiting SSL. So you started talking about TLS. Maybe can you just spend a couple minutes just talking about the importance of TLS moving forward and some of the pros and cons that you're seeing within your community that you speak to?
Sure. So, yeah, particularly in the last year, there's been a big move towards using TLS and moving away from SSL, which was great at one point, but now it's just not the best thing that's out there. So TLS is definitely the direction that Akamai has moved in. And last year really brought home the need to move beyond SSL, particularly when Shellshock came along in the fall of 2014.
Why sorry to interrupt you. What
Sure.
In particular you said Shellshock? Why did Shellshock as the straw that broke the camel's back? What in particular?
Because it made such extensive use of weaknesses within SSL.
Gotcha.
It's a little bit more complicated than that, but that was a pretty big reason. So,
but this is good though, because decision makers, aren't necessarily getting into the details. They're sort of at a helicopter view. But
yeah.
Anybody who's any bit associated with the underpinnings of trust in the internet has to be aware of their assets and protecting them with SSL or TLS. And if they're putting services in the cloud, some companies are just not using web servers on premise anymore. So what are they doing about looking at their contracts and looking at their third-party providers to make sure that they've got their ducks in a row and that their contracts are aligned for managing the pieces we're just talking about, from TLS and SSL to your widgets and applications that are allowed to be downloaded onto your sites because marketing wants to have a fancy follow me button?
Yeah, definitely.
I'm going to definitely change gears with this question, but I found it very interesting. One of that I was reading about the humanity and security. I'd love to get your thoughts. It was a previous discussion you had about kind of the burnout, depression, and stress in the security community. And essentially, I'd love to get your thoughts on that. And since you had spearheaded a conversation with Christian Turnus about it, and health and wellness is a part of being a human being, and in this industry, it's not really talked about because probably for a whole variety of reasons that we can talk to our therapists about, but I'd love to hear your comments about that.
So one of the blogs that I write and have written for the past going on 6 years in December is a blog called the OCD Diaries. And I started that blog to start writing about my experiences of being diagnosed with OCD and the various tools that I had to develop to learn how to manage that disorder. And over time, the blog became a larger conversation place to talk about depression, anxiety, a lot of the things that many of us deal with in life. And I immediately had a built-in readership in the security community because you have a lot of people in the industry who, it's not just the security industry, it's everywhere, but the people in the security industry who had been reading the content I was creating for searchsecurity.com and then CSO magazine, they saw that blog and the issues were really resonating with them. And at the same time, kind of in parallel with my writing that blog, there was a movement started up called the Technology Burnout Project, which was all about discussing coping tools for people who suffer from depression and anxiety and other things that are byproducts of burnout, because security can be a very stressful profession, as you well know. So over time, the things that I was writing about and the efforts of groups like that really dovetailed together. Now, at the same time, you had my colleague Christian Turnus, who has been a huge advocate of what he calls humanity and security, remembering that in the security industry, in companies, that people are the most important assets, and if their mental machinery is breaking down because of the way people communicate with them, the way they deal with pressures, that things break down in the larger sense. So he had within Akamai a humanity and security summit of sorts in December 2013. And he knew about the OCD Diaries, so he asked me to speak at that. But it's an ongoing effort to destigmatize mental illness, to destigmify things like anxiety and depression, and to give people who work in our industry kind of a life raft, so they know that other people are looking out for them and that we have tools to share that can help them get through their stuff. And that's good for their employers. It's good for them in terms of their entire lives. And to me, it's just common sense. And it's great because while there is a lot of stigma still, I have seen things getting better in the last 10 years or so. Things that people just wouldn't talk about with their work colleagues are talked about a lot more, particularly depression, and somebody has ADD. And one of the things that I've learned over time, and I write about it a lot, is the way I put it is taking your mental disorders and turning them into superpowers. So if you have OCD, it can create a lot of disorder in your life, but it also makes you very good at organizing projects and gives you a drive to get things done. Or that's been the case for me anyway. There was the part of the OCD that I had to bring to heal, the part that was endless worry, anxiety, and things like that make you dysfunctional. But there were also the parts that I didn't want to lose, that drive that it gave me. And, with somebody has ADD or ADHD, not very good with organizing, but very creative, very, very proficient in taking complex mathematical problems and making sense of them.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with you. In fact, with my team that I employ, we have analysts in our organization that are quite upfront about the spectrum of Asperger's, which is on the autism spectrum, and that's actually quite a benefit because it allows an individual to really hone in and focus on things that maybe someone else might not be able to, because their ability to really focus in on some details of an audit, for example. But like you said, it's sometimes these conversations are harder to bring up because there is a kind of a societal stigma, so to speak. But in security, it's sort of like warfare in many respects. When the veterans come back from Afghanistan and Iraq and they're suffering from PTSD, which is impacting their brain function. And if they haven't lost a limb, or they could be 100 yards from a blast, but the blast waves go through them, and all of a sudden they're not sure why they're not performing efficiently, and it can be really confusing to them because they haven't lost a limb or an arm. And so sometimes I think the anxiety and depression and the various autism spectrum functions, they're disabling, but there's no overt signs. So it's harder to bring those conversations to light because people aren't seeing someone limping or on crutches.
Yeah, for sure. And, a lot of people in the security industry are veterans themselves. I know people in our industry who have seen things that I could never understand because I wasn't there. And the traumas that come with it. And in some ways it makes them ideally suited for this kind of work. But yeah, I mean, it is high pressure, especially when you're a company and you're dealing with, you find that something like Heartbleed has come along and that you're very much affected, and that creates this whole process to deal with it. And I don't think it's for the faint of heart, for sure.
No, it's definitely not, and I applaud you in your efforts to tackle this, because I think it's important in the spectrum. Even in the research I've done, when you're constantly under threat, it's putting pressure on a very primitive part of our brain. So if we're not recontextualizing like you have and saying this, I'm going to keep some of these positive pieces, but I'm going to mitigate these other pieces, but I'm not going to label everything as bad. It's important to do that, to be a great security professional, because if we're not taking advantage of this learning and this introspection, we're constantly going to be triggered, which is not a healthy state for a human being to be in, to be at their very best as a human being, if we're constantly in a fight or flight mode. So yeah, what a great conversation that we're having about this, because it's not a discussion that I think is had enough within our security teams and within the IT profession as a whole.
Yeah.
Just shifting gears a little bit, as far as where you see the balance of 2015. So if you are a decision maker in IT and IT security, and you're budgeting for next year, you're talking with your teams about what's important, where do you see the top 2 or 3 threats that need to be kind of front and center with decision makers for the coming couple months?
Well, even though things quieted down somewhat in 2015, I think that still in the next 5 years, we're going to be dealing with a lot more of these super vulnerabilities. So Heartbleed, Shellshock, Poodle, to me, those are super vulnerabilities where the depth and the broadness of what that affected in 2014 was pretty unprecedented. And a lot of that was driven by researchers who were finding these problems in what we had considered tried and true technology that everybody had been using for a while. And they were vulnerabilities that had been there for a long time. And because Heartbleed was discovered, more researchers decided to start digging, taking a closer look at SSL, for example, and then they found things like Shellshock and Poodle, and there are always vulnerabilities affecting OpenSSL. So a lot of that stuff, that is still in 2016 and beyond. Companies need to be much better prepared for that. They need to be working on their incident response programs and, making sure that the people that they have who are the best at dropping everything and diving right into damage control are, that they're taking a look at that and making plans. And also, I think that companies need to really keep their eye out for a lot of these hacking groups that have cropped up in the last couple of years. So, for example, in 2015, we saw a lot of attack activity from a group calling itself DD4BC. We just found out they've changed their name to the Armada Collective. But groups like that have been a problem. You have other groups like the Our Mind team. You have what everybody has known about for a few years now, which is Anonymous, where with something like Anonymous, you're dealing with hacktivism. So if, for example, you're a company that has taken a position publicly that they don't like, they start directing attacks at you, DDoS activity in particular. So these are things that are going to continue to be a problem.
So the way I understood the last one is when you were talking about Armada Collective and Anonymous, if you're a decision maker, basically you need to really look at your brand and see what your message is, and then reach out and really understand, okay, who are you pissing off with your message that you potentially could be at risk, and really ranking that risk against the potential damage that could become if you become a target through a DDoS and a target of their ire, and just a target of them not being pleased with your message. Is that essentially what you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay.
More or less.
And I love that you brought up this incident response piece. So you also feel that security is, yes, its own domain, but that it really needs to be integrated with disaster recovery and business continuity planning.
Yep.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Those three are great. And I think when you mentioned the super-vulnerabilities, is basically is what you're saying, looking at just to continuing to review your infrastructure and you're also, I use third parties, meaning your cloud service providers, your hosting providers, and seeing where the potential vulnerabilities lie with Heartbleed, Shellshock, OpenSSL within the kind of ecosystem of deployed assets you have within your organizations.
Yeah, most definitely. And that, the third party point, earlier in this conversation, we talked about stuff like third party technology, plugins, but yeah, third party providers. If you're a company that suffers a data breach and the bad guys got in because of weaknesses from one of your third party partners, let's say, it's not good enough to point a finger and say that was their fault. It's the responsibility of your company to really put the feet of partners to the fire and really question thoroughly before signing on about what their security procedures are.
That's a huge point, and really examining the third parties makes from both the contractually, but then but the very specifics can go a long way. Just curious, do you have a particular opinion about cybersecurity competitions and their effectiveness of growing the talent pool of security technologists in the community?
There's so great talent out there. Every year, that pool of talent just gets bigger and bigger and bigger, especially as we move along in the digital natives. So the younger folks start to get interested in this profession.
Yeah, it's. I love this concept of gaming. I just did a blog post on it regarding gaming, and they're doing a lot of research on the effectiveness of gaming, not just and setting up security sandboxes for creating games and competitions and hacking competitions to develop skills, but just in the larger framework of the positive benefits to building and developing persistence and willpower. And as you were talking about superpowers earlier, is this whole concept of gaming is really they're looking at much more as a positive element to kind of the digitification of our younger generations to growing up.
Yeah.
So I want to thank you for being on the show, Bill. It's been a lot of fun getting to know your philosophies and your approaches to what the future is going to look like, and what a security intelligence looks like, and how you report on it. Do you have anything that you want to say to the larger community? Any thoughts that you want to leave my listener base with?
Yeah, just remember that there's no such thing as 100% ironclad security. Every company has weaknesses, and a lot of companies are going to see data breaches in their existence. And, really the important thing is to have a plan to respond to those things in the fastest, most responsible manner, instead of the panic that can set in if you're not properly prepared. And, to me, that's just as important as any technology that you buy into.
I love that message. And it's that agility within the company to respond. And I guess to be really having a strong communication in the midst of when you need to do a 2-minute drill. Most sports teams don't just make their 2-minute drill up in the final 2 minutes. They practice it well in advance so they can execute on that. So that's a really great message. And I want to applaud you, Bill, for the work you're doing with getting threat intelligence that's timely and accurate out to the larger community. And also your work with OCD Diaries and helping with mental health and making sure people remain strong, not just physically, but mentally with this within the space that we work in with IT security. So thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you for your kind words and for having me on.
So that wraps up episode number 30. We're really moving along, and I hope you've been enjoying the quality of the guests that I'm having on the show. I want to encourage everybody that's interested in joining the CIO Mastermind groups that I have monthly. Please go to the bottom of this podcast show notes page, where there'll be a link to join my newsletter that'll let you know about when these events are coming up, these virtual CIO Masterminds. So these are highly focused, 1.5 hours with 4 to 6 of your peers. Imagine for a second the very smart people in a room, and you're able to ask them questions about challenges that you're having and receive great feedback on. So they're meant to deliver massive value. So if you're interested in joining one of my CIO Mastermind groups, just go to the bottom, click on the link, and you can sign up to be notified when these events are happening. And when you're selected, we'll put you right in. So with that, I want to thank you for listening and appreciate you as an audience, and look forward to seeing you on episode number 31. So there you have it. This wraps another episode of Bill Murphy's Red Zone podcast. To get all the relevant show notes, please go to our blog at www.redzonetech.net/podcast. Additionally, make sure you go to iTunes and leave your comments in iTunes about the show. This helps our show rankings enormously, and it helps support the show. Until next time, I appreciate you very much for listening. Thank you.